There is a strange moment that happens in some relationships that many people don't understand until much later. It's the moment when you finally step back, and suddenly the other person begins treating you differently. They start listening more carefully. They start speaking more respectfully. Sometimes they even begin making the effort they never made before. And the question that naturally appears in your mind is unsettling. Why did it take me walking away for this to happen? Because for a long time before that moment, you were there. You were patient. You were understanding. You tried to communicate. You tried to solve problems calmly. You tried to protect the relationship. But somehow, the effort you gave during those moments didn't seem to create the same response. It was only after you created distance that something changed. And this is one of the most confusing experiences people have in relationships. Not because walking away is always the solution, but because it reveals something about human behavior that many people never talk about. Respect is not always shaped by how much someone gives. Sometimes it is shaped by what someone is willing to tolerate. When a person is always available, always understanding, always willing to absorb discomfort to keep the peace, something subtle begins happening in the dynamic. Their presence starts feeling permanent. Their patience begins feeling expected. Their boundaries begin feeling flexible. And slowly, the other person begins acting under an assumption that is rarely spoken out loud. They're not going anywhere. Once that assumption takes hold, behavior often changes. Not because someone suddenly becomes cruel, but because familiarity begins replacing awareness. The effort that once existed slowly fades. Attention becomes inconsistent. Respect becomes something that appears only when it feels necessary. Now here's the difficult truth that many people eventually realize. Some individuals do not fully recognize the value of a relationship until the possibility of losing it becomes real. When distance appears, the dynamic shifts. The certainty they once felt disappears. And suddenly they see something they had stopped noticing. Your absence. Your boundaries. Your willingness to choose peace over constant compromise. In that moment, the relationship no longer feels guaranteed. And for the first time in a long time, your presence regains its weight. This is not about manipulation, and it's not about playing games. It's about understanding a deeper pattern in human relationships. People often treat what feels permanent differently than what feels valuable. And sometimes the moment a person begins respecting you again is the moment they realize you are no longer willing to remain where you are not valued. Today, we're going to explore why this happens. Why respect sometimes appears only after someone walks away. And more importantly, what this pattern teaches us about boundaries, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to protect your peace. Because when you understand this dynamic clearly, something important begins changing in the way you approach every relationship in your life. And if you're here with us on Tilt and Chill, I'm really glad you're part of this conversation. This space exists for people who want to reflect deeply about life, relationships, and the quiet truths that help us become better human beings. So take a moment, settle in, and listen closely. Because the moment someone begins respecting you after you walk away reveals something powerful. Not just about them, but about you. Part 1. When your presence becomes predictable. There's a quiet shift that happens in some relationships long before anyone realizes it. It begins the moment your presence starts feeling predictable. Not dependable in the healthy sense, but predictable in a way that slowly changes how people treat you. At the beginning of most relationships, people pay close attention to one another. There is awareness in the way they speak, care in the way they respond. They notice when something matters to you. They notice when they've crossed a line. Respect exists naturally in those early moments because the connection still feels valuable and uncertain at the same time. But over time, something subtle can begin to change. Familiarity grows. The relationship becomes comfortable. And comfort, when it is not balanced with awareness, can slowly turn into assumption. The assumption that you will always be there, that no matter what happens, the relationship will continue the same way tomorrow. Once that assumption settles in, behavior often begins shifting in small ways. Nothing dramatic, just quiet changes in effort. Someone who once listened carefully begins responding more quickly. Someone who once made the effort to understand you begins brushing aside certain concerns. Moments that once carried attention begin passing by unnoticed. Most people don't react strongly to these changes when they first appear. In fact, many people respond with patience. They tell themselves that everyone has difficult periods, that people become distracted by work, stress, or responsibilities. And in many cases, that understanding is a sign of emotional maturity. But there is a difference between understanding someone's difficult moment and slowly accepting a pattern that reduces the value of your presence. This difference is where many people quietly lose the balance in their relationships. Because when someone becomes predictable in a way that suggests they will always stay, always understand, always absorb discomfort without consequence, the other person may begin operating under a quiet belief, not spoken, not even fully conscious, but powerful enough to shape behavior. They're not going anywhere. And once that belief becomes part of the dynamic, effort often begins decreasing. Not always intentionally, but gradually. Small things begin changing. The urgency to repair misunderstandings fades. The attention that once existed in conversation becomes inconsistent. The awareness of how certain actions affect you becomes weaker. What once felt like a partnership slowly begins feeling like something else, a dynamic where one person maintains the stability of the relationship while the other moves more freely inside it. Now, this does not mean that the other person suddenly stopped caring. Human relationships are rarely that simple. But care and respect are not always the same thing. Someone may still value the connection while slowly becoming less attentive to the balance that once protected it. And when that balance fades, the difference becomes noticeable. You might start realizing that your patience is expected rather than appreciated. Your understanding becomes something the other person relies on rather than reciprocates. Your willingness to maintain peace begins carrying more weight than their willingness to protect the relationship. At first, many people respond by trying harder. They communicate more carefully. They try to solve misunderstandings calmly. They attempt to restore the dynamic that once made the relationship feel equal. But effort from one side alone rarely restores balance. Because respect does not grow from how much one person sacrifices. It grows from how clearly both people recognize the value of the connection. And when someone becomes too certain that you will remain no matter how the relationship shifts, something important begins fading. The awareness that your presence is a choice. That awareness is often what keeps respect alive. When people recognize that someone chooses to be in their life, they treat that presence differently. They protect it. They value it. They do not assume it will always remain the same. But when that awareness disappears, the relationship can quietly drift into a place where effort becomes uneven. And this is where the dynamic often reaches a turning point. Because when a person who has always stayed finally begins stepping back, something changes in the other person's perception. Suddenly, the certainty that once existed disappears. And with that certainty gone, something else begins returning. Attention, effort, respect. But why does it often take that moment for people to see what was always there? That is the deeper question we'll explore in the next part.
Part 2. When absence reveals what presence could not. There is something about absence that reveals truths that presence often hides. When someone is always there, always patient, always understanding, always willing to maintain the connection, the relationship can begin operating on a quiet form of certainty. The certainty that the person will remain. And certainty changes human behavior in ways we rarely notice while it is happening. Think about how people treat things they believe will always be available. Attention becomes relaxed. Effort becomes occasional rather than intentional. Gratitude becomes assumed rather than expressed. This is not always cruelty. Often it is simply the result of familiarity mixed with comfort. But comfort without awareness can slowly dull the appreciation that once existed. And when appreciation fades, respect often fades with it. That is why something remarkable happens when distance enters the picture. The moment someone begins stepping back, emotionally or physically, the certainty that once existed begins disappearing. The relationship is no longer operating on the quiet assumption that tomorrow will look exactly like today. Suddenly, the dynamic feels different. Messages that once waited hours for a reply are answered more quickly. Conversations that once felt casual suddenly feel more attentive. The person who once moved comfortably inside the relationship begins noticing something they had stopped paying attention to: the possibility of losing it. Human beings often become most aware of value at the moment it feels uncertain. This does not mean people only respect what they fear losing, but uncertainty has a way of sharpening perception. It interrupts routine. It breaks the quiet rhythm of assumption that had slowly formed. When someone steps back, it forces the other person to see the relationship again with fresh eyes. They begin noticing things that had slowly faded into the background: the emotional stability the other person provided, the patience they offered, the way they kept the connection grounded even during difficult moments. These things often go unnoticed when they are constant, not because they are unimportant, but because the human mind adapts quickly to what becomes familiar. Once something becomes part of the normal landscape of life, it often disappears from conscious awareness until it changes. And when that change arrives, the absence creates contrast. The silence where conversation once existed, the distance where presence once felt guaranteed. The difference becomes visible. Now here is the part that many people struggle to understand. Walking away is not powerful because it creates fear. It becomes powerful because it restores clarity. For both people, for the person stepping back, it reveals something important about their own dignity. They realize they have the ability to choose environments where their presence is valued rather than assumed. For the other person, it reveals something equally important. The relationship was never as permanent as they believed. The stability they relied on was not automatic. It existed because someone chose to maintain it. And when that realization arrives, behavior often changes. Effort returns. Respect returns. Attention returns. But this raises a difficult question that many people eventually face. If respect appears only after distance is created, what does that say about the balance that existed before? This is where deeper reflection becomes necessary. Because the goal of understanding this dynamic is not to encourage people to walk away from every relationship. The goal is to recognize something about how human connections function. Respect thrives where awareness exists. It grows in relationships where both people recognize that the other person's presence is not something guaranteed. It is something chosen. And when that awareness is mutual, effort becomes natural rather than reactive. But when one person carries that awareness alone, the relationship slowly drifts out of balance. That imbalance often continues quietly
until something interrupts it. Sometimes that interruption is distance. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is the moment a person finally decides they deserve a different kind of dynamic in their life. And when that moment arrives, the shift that follows can reveal more about the relationship than years of conversation ever did. Because the clearest measure of respect is not what someone says when everything feels secure. It is how they respond when the connection is no longer certain.
Part 3. The quiet power of being willing to leave.
There is a realization many people eventually arrive at after experiencing this pattern in relationships. Respect often changes the moment someone realizes you are capable of leaving. Not because you want to hurt them, not because you are trying to prove something, but because your willingness to step away changes the balance of the relationship. It reveals something that may not have been clear before. Your presence was never guaranteed. It was a choice, and choice carries weight. When a person understands that someone remains in their life because they choose to be there, not because they must be there, the dynamic becomes very different. Respect grows naturally in spaces where both people recognize that the connection exists through mutual choice. But when one person feels certain that the other will always stay, no matter how the relationship shifts, the balance slowly begins to tilt. Not intentionally, but gradually. The relationship begins operating on comfort rather than awareness. And comfort alone is not strong enough to sustain respect over time. Now, this is where many people misunderstand the lesson behind walking away. The lesson is not that leaving is always the solution. The lesson is that self-respect must exist inside the relationship for respect from others to remain stable. When someone knows that you will protect your dignity, your time, and your emotional well-being, they naturally interact with you differently. They become more aware of the boundaries that shape the relationship. They recognize that the connection deserves care. But when someone believes that the relationship will continue regardless of how they behave, the sense of responsibility often weakens. And once responsibility weakens, effort often follows. This is why the willingness to walk away carries a quiet form of strength. It signals that your presence in someone's life is meaningful, but it is not unconditional in the sense that it must tolerate everything. You value the relationship, but you also value yourself. And that balance is what protects dignity inside any healthy connection. Many people spend years believing that the way to preserve relationships is by being endlessly patient, endlessly accommodating, always choosing peace over discomfort. While patience and understanding are beautiful qualities, they can become harmful when they erase the space where self-respect should exist. Healthy relationships do not require one person to carry the emotional weight of maintaining harmony. They thrive when both individuals recognize that the connection deserves equal awareness from both sides. And when that awareness disappears, something eventually forces the dynamic to change. Sometimes that change arrives through conversation. Sometimes it arrives through time. And sometimes it arrives through the quiet decision that a person can no longer remain where their presence is taken for granted. When that decision is made, something remarkable often happens. The person who once felt invisible inside the relationship begins seeing themselves differently. They begin recognizing the value they bring into the lives of others, the patience, the stability, the emotional strength that once held the connection together. They begin realizing that these qualities are not weaknesses. They are strengths that deserve to exist in environments where they are recognized and respected. And once someone truly understands that, something inside them shifts. They no longer measure their worth by how hard they can hold on to a relationship. They measure it by the quality of the relationships they choose to remain inside. Because the healthiest connections in life are not built on someone's willingness to stay no matter what happens. They are built on mutual awareness. Two people who understand something simple but powerful. The other person is here because they want to be. And that awareness creates something that cannot be forced. Respect. When that respect exists, distance is never required to make someone see your value. Your presence already speaks clearly enough. And when it does not exist, the willingness to walk away becomes the quiet reminder that your life deserves relationships where dignity, care, and respect grow together rather than slowly fade apart. Before we wrap up, just take a moment to sit with this idea. Most breakthroughs in life don't arrive with a loud announcement. They usually show up quietly, inside a problem we've been avoiding, a decision we've been delaying, or a step we've been hesitant to take. And sometimes all it takes is a small shift, the willingness to face something directly, for life to begin moving again. If something in this conversation made you pause and think, then this time together was worth it. And if you enjoy this kind of reflection, conversations about life, perspective, growth, and the fascinating things that shape the way we see the world, that's exactly what we explore here on Tilt and Chill. So, if you'd like more of these moments, feel free to subscribe and stay connected with the channel. And if this message might help someone else today, share it with them. Sometimes the right idea at the right time can make a real difference. Thank you for spending part of your day here. Until next time, take care of yourself, stay curious about life, and keep moving forward.